Ladies and gentlemen, let's go into the question of what urgent priorities are there for Hindu society, which also means what are not urgent priorities, because there is a bit of uncertainty about that. For example, I hear very many people say that all India needs is a Hindu Rashtra. Now, first of all, of course, it's a question what that word exactly means. But at any rate, right now, if you start talking about Hindu Rashtra, you don't have any formula for enacting anything that is different, bringing about any real reform with real consequences. It's just a name tag. And it is, moreover, a name tag that is only calculated to make you many enemies. Or, in fact, the enemies that will get vocal then are, of course, already enemies of you now, but then they will have an extra argument. They will use that to influence all the many fence sitters and people who don't know anything about India. And so they will pit everyone against you. And in return for that, there's no gain. You don't win anything, it's just a name tag. So I don't advise that stuff, apart from, of course, possible questions of principle, whether a Hindu Rashtra is a good thing and so on. You know, many people will say, no, we don't want a Hindu Rashtra. Well, I leave that question in the middle. I just say that strategically, you have no use talking about a Hindu Rashtra. It will not gain you anything. Similarly, a uniform civil code. I think it's desirable. You see, my country has a uniform civil code. It said in the constitution, all Belgians are equal before the law. And I think that other countries really would do well to have a similar clause. And India has similar clauses to some extent, but they are overruled by other clauses in the constitution that create a discrimination between citizens, and especially a discrimination on the basis of religion. So to say that India is a secular state, which by definition means a state where all citizens, regardless of religion, are equal before the law, that is not true in the case of India. India is very definitely not a secular state. If you want to know if some India watcher in journalism or in the law profession or in academics, if you want to know whether he's competent or not, you ask him whether India is a secular state. 99% will say, yes, India is a secular state, only its secular character is threatened by these ugly, vicious Hindu nationalists. But basically, it is a secular state. Well, it is definitely not a secular state. There are a number of discriminations in practice, in law, and in the constitution. So the question of a universal civil code is really about this equality before the law. Everybody ought to be equal before the law. In India, that is not the case. And so the classical example that Hindus always bring up is that Hindus are bound by law to monogamy, whereas Muslims can have 4 wives. Okay? So I don't think that is very consequential in demographic terms, but at any rate, before the law, it is a really serious problem of principle. It means that Indians are not equal before the law. It also means, for example, that Muslim men and Muslim women are not equal before the law, because a Muslim man can repudiate his wife by himself, whereas the wife has to pass through judicial proceedings if she wants a divorce. So there are a number of inequalities built into this system of separate family law codes. So against that, I am in favor of a uniform civil code. It should be introduced, but it is not a priority. It makes very little difference for you yourselves. And also traditionally, Hindus have never had a common civil code themselves. You see, if you look at the Shastras, the Manu Smriti and so on, you can see that there are different laws for different groups of people, different castes, between the sexes, between the age groups. There are different laws, and this was deemed natural. And so when the Muslims came into India with their Sharia, this in itself was no problem for anyone. You see, Hindus were used to separate civil codes, so Sharia was just one more. So this is, in a modern state, desirable to have a common civil code. I'm all for it, but it is really not a priority. It, again, will create enemies. You have seen in the agitation around the recent law for naturalization of refugees, that this created an enormous agitation. Now, that is nothing, that agitation that you've seen in February was nothing compared to the agitation you will get if you abolish the separate Sharia, if you bring in a common civil code. So again, ultimately, it is desirable. At the moment, it will create trouble that you can't handle. And anyway, there are more urgent things to do. Similarly, many people talk about temple restoration. We should bring back not just the Ayodhya temple, we should bring back all the temples that have been forcibly replaced with mosques. Well, I'm not so sure about that. Again, you're going to create a lot of trouble and get a lot of bad press internationally for very little gain. You see, if you manage to talk Islam out of the heads of the Muslims, they themselves will bring these buildings back and make them temples again. So that perhaps is desirable in the long run, but these temples themselves are much less important. Again, it's desirable that all the Hindu sacred sites have Hindu temples on them and are used for Hindu worship. I am not at all against that, but it is not a priority at all. So what is a priority? Far more urgent and also far more easy to achieve is to bring in equality in the Constitution. This mostly concerns Articles 25 to 30 of the Constitution. As you know, Article 30 says that minorities shall have every right to set up their own and to manage their own educational institutions. Not ruled on in the Constitution, but effectively following the same principle is the matter of temple management. All minorities have a right to manage their own places of worship. They cannot be nationalized, they cannot be taken over by the state, whereas Hindu temples are systematically plundered by bureaucrats and state governments nationalize them. So that's a clear and very, very important, very consequential discrimination. Now, that is something to abolish. What should be there in the Constitution is full equality between citizens. In fact, I am for a radical reform in this regard, namely to scrap the entire notion of minority. In a secular state, there are no minorities. You see statisticians, sociologists, in describing the population, can define certain groups, and those who are less than 50% are automatically minorities. They can do that for their purposes of research, that's all right, but the law should not recognize minorities. The law only recognizes citizens, and all citizens have equal rights. So things like a ministry for the minorities or a minorities commission, they should go. In a secular state, there is no room for them. Now, perhaps this is a tall order. And again, you see, that's a matter of principle. That's not so urgent. But what is urgent, what is very consequential, is effectively bringing in equality. And so scrapping the discriminations that exist in Article 25 to 30, which give minorities a number of rights that the majority doesn't have. Now, strictly speaking, it is not said in those articles that the rights conferred on the minorities do not count for the majority. In fact, in a sub-clause of Article 30, it is specifically said that the minority should not be discriminated against. By whom? Well, I suppose by the majority, or in favor of the majority. So it says no discrimination between the minorities and the majority. Now that I can agree with. There should indeed not be any discrimination between a group that happens to have more than 50% and groups that have less than 50%. There should be no such discrimination. So if you properly interpret this article, you may already have your non-discrimination, have your equality. Indeed, I think that when the Constitution was written, this is what the fathers of the Constitution had in mind. You should see the Constitution was written between 1947 and 1949. And at that time, Hindus were 100% in power, strictly speaking. At least if you define people like Nehru, like Ambedkar as Hindus. They were born Hindus. What they did with that later on in life is another matter. But at any rate, the minorities were not in a position to push their own demands. On the contrary, the Muslims at that time had the enormous guilt of the partition, this calamity they brought over India and the Indian population. Christians at that time had the trauma of decolonization. At the very same time, in the same years, in nearby China, the communists were fighting their way from their little holdout, winning over against the nationalists, who were very close with the American missionaries. And so wherever the communists came to power, the Christian missionaries were very, very lucky if they were only expelled, if they were only thrown out of the country, because most of them were imprisoned or killed. So Christians in India looked with great fear. India might do the same thing. You know, we don't know what is going to happen. And maybe the Hindus, even the Muslims, get angry with us and we will suffer the same fate. So at that time, it is not like they could impose anything on Hindus that Hindus didn't want. They were completely on the defensive. So when the fathers of the Constitution voted for the present text of the Constitution, I am pretty sure they did not have in mind to impose a discrimination on the Hindus. They had in mind full equality. So it is very possible that if the present government approaches the Supreme Court for an authoritative interpretation of these articles of the Constitution, that they themselves, without Parliament interfering, without any need for an amendment of the constitution, that they will say that the existing constitution guarantees full equality. This is possible. So in that case, it is very easy. What this government has to do is to take an initiative, to mandate a few lawyers to go to the Supreme Court to work this out. And fairly soon, you can have the assurance that all semblance of discrimination stands abolished. What happened historically is that the Constitution was reinterpreted in an anti-Hindu sense during the secular regime, already during Nehru, who had Maulana Azad as his education minister, but especially under Indira Gandhi, who, with the help of her education minister Nurul Hassan and her secretary P.N. Haksar, really changed the face of India by reinterpreting everything in an anti-Hindu sense, by, for example, changing the textbooks, the school books of history, to reinterpret the whole of Indian history in an anti-Hindu sense, in a pro-minority sense. So that is something that historically happened, and the result is that there is now a very negative connotation around the word Hindu. And it is easy to discriminate against Hindus, to insult Hindus, because the word Hindu itself has a very negative connotation. That is why you see that a number of Hindu groups are running for the exit, are trying to be declared non-Hindus. You know the story of the Ramakrishna mission that had schools in West Bengal and that feared that these schools would be taken over by the communist state government. To escape that fate, they tried to get themselves declared by court as non-Hindus. Because minorities cannot suffer this fate of this nationalization, they are autonomous, they can manage their own educational institutions. In their case, it didn't work out. There are a few cases where it did work out. At the state level in Punjab, the Arya Samaj, for the same reasons, for safeguarding their educational institutions, did get minority status. You've heard recently about the Veerashaivas in Karnataka. They also are recognized as a minority. And so this is something that doesn't exist in the other religions. There are no groups of Muslims trying to get themselves declared non-Muslim. Even the Ahmadiyyas, who are persecuted in Pakistan by the other Muslims, nevertheless insist that they are Muslims, try to prove that they're better Muslims than everyone. So that is because there's nothing wrong with being a Muslim. You don't suffer any disadvantage for being a Muslim. In India, on the contrary, you get favors, you get privileges for being a minority. This is even true under the BJP government, where the second BJP government started with creating a number of colleges specifically for Muslims, minority-only colleges. And so there are a number of initiatives taken by the Ministry for Minorities to appease the Muslims. That which they used to 20, 30 years ago, they used to blame the Congress for, that is now what they are doing themselves. So there is a premium on being a minority in India. There is a disadvantage on being Hindu. I'm in favor of abolishing that. I estimate that probably this can be done through the courts, that no law has to be changed for that. But if necessary, you should not hesitate to amend that law, to amend that article of the Constitution, and to bring it in line with general principles of equality. So that, I think, is really absolutely the most urgent thing to do. It is very consequential for the life of Hindu society that you can pass on your religion to the next generations, that through temples you can pass it on to the masses, you can help um, temples become the centers of Hindu life again, to take initiatives educationally, culturally, and so on, caritatively. So for that, you need right now to restore equality, to enshrine firmly equality in the Constitution. That is very consequential. And a pleasant circumstance around it is it is also very easy to do. You don't take anything away from the minorities. In the case of the Uniform Civil Code, you take from the Muslims their Sharia, their separate personal law. They don't like that. In fact, they will militantly act against it. But in this case, you only enact equality. And so nobody can be against that. Nobody can rise up and say, I am against equality. Not publicly at any rate. Now, I admit that the Nehruvian intellectuals are wily enough to think up a way around that. They will say, oh yeah, but these ugly, vicious Hindu nationalists, what they mean is not equality. No, they mean to bring in some kind of discrimination, majoritarianism through the back door, and they call it equality. You know? So I'm not against equality, but I'm against disequality, against their equality. Now that, you see, that they're certainly going to try, but that's so mendacious, so obviously mendacious, that you can ward that off, probably. You know, there you can restore honesty and define equality as simple equality. What they will say more, in order to obstruct you, in order to sabotage equality, is that sometimes you need a bit of inequality in order to get equality. And the major example of that is the so-called affirmative action for blacks in the United States. Now, I don't know, I don't want to comment on the reservation policies in the United States. I don't know if this policy of reservations for blacks is a proper compensation for the injustice that blacks have suffered in the past, the time of slavery. But at least the very fact that there was a historical injustice, that is something nobody can deny. So in the case of the blacks, there is something to compensate for, or there is an injustice with consequences that have to be set straight, that have to be corrected. In the case of India, by contrast, this is just the opposite. You see, some of these sociologists and so on, they pretend that Hinduism, simply by virtue of being a majority, owes the minority something, that it has to compensate for some inherent injustice against the minority. Now, that is really the whole world upside down. In reality, in Indian history, Hindus have never discriminated against the minorities. And here I weigh my words. I know that some outsiders are going to be very surprised, but that's really how it has worked in history. Hindus have never discriminated against the minorities. On the contrary, if there are minorities in India, it is very, very partly the remnant of foreign invaders that came into India, Arabs, Turks, Afghans, Syrian Christians, but very minoritarian. And I of course do not want to say that these people are foreigners, that they shouldn't be in India. They have been in India for centuries by now, you see, so let that rest, you know, they are Indians. However, most of the minority members were originally Hindus and have converted to Christianity or to Islam precisely because it brought them advantages, precisely because those groups were privileged. That was very strongly the case in the Portuguese territories. That was, oh my God.
Yeah. Hello.
I can't see you anymore at the moment.
Yeah, I think your connection must be weak, but we can hear you, sir. Please go ahead. Yeah. Probably
Yeah,
it'll get restored. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
right. So the minorities have discriminated against Hindus and given a lot of favors to people who came and joined them. For example, if a Hindu had a quarrel with his neighbor and they went to court, if one of the two Hindus converted, then he would automatically win his trial. So there was a great premium on converting. Like, for instance, many Muslims till today belong to the urban craftsman communities. Why? Well, partly because those groups were favored when they sought employment from the Muslim courts. Then, of course, there was the whole system of the jizya, the toleration tax that Hindus had to pay that Muslims did not have to pay, and so on. Even in the British period, which tried to be more or less even between the religions, it was still a good thing, a useful thing to be a Christian or to become a Christian. So the minorities, if they want some historical compensation, it is not they who should get it from Hindus. No, it is they who should pay it to Hindus. So if you want to talk about historical compensation, it is Hindus who should be favored. That would be just, that would be fair. Now, I am not at all in favor of historical compensation. I think all these things are long in the past. When I see in my own country, the lower classes have come up without any revolution, have come up without massively stealing from the upper classes and so on. No, they have just emancipated themselves. They have taken their historical disadvantage in stride, and they have come up. And so that's what should happen in India. If there are lower groups, let them come up. That's fine. There should be equality. They should not be discriminated against. But compensation, I'm not so sure about. In case of caste, well, maybe historically, although it's, 70 years is a long time, maybe now it should be abolished. I mean, we can talk about that. But a compensation to the religious minorities, that is total nonsense. That is unfair, and it shouldn't be there. There should be equality. So I think that in spite of the foreseeable attempts by the Nehruvians to sabotage equality for the Hindus, it is something that you can achieve without too many problems. So unlike the Common Civil Code, this is really something you can achieve. It's even something you can explain to enemies like the New York Times, like the BBC and so on. They may come around and see the correctness of this purpose. So that's what I would advocate. Take as your primary goal to achieve equality. You see, there's 4 more years of BJP rule in India. That should be enough to achieve this. If the BJP does not get re-elected, then at least it will have the historical merit of achieving legal equality for Hindu society. And from there on, it is Hindu society that has to take it up. I don't think that the state should decree advantages for Hindu society. No, from there on a level playing field, it is for Hindus themselves to to flourish. So that's what I advocate, and I expect you to have opinions about that. I'm ready for remarks or questions.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Elst. I think your video is again frozen. Maybe you may have to click on that, but you know, in case you click something else, we may lose your connection. So we kept quiet, but that's okay.
Okay.
We can go on. Just check out if your video icon is by any chance, closed.
Yes.
Yeah, now you're on. Perfect. Now
Okay.
you're on. Great. You're on. You're on now. Yeah. I think you've really picked up the crux of it. I think once Article 25 to 30 is corrected, most of the problems that we have would get rectified. Definitely, I think you really hit the nail at the right spot. Um, but another cause of serious concern for the Hindu society is the narrative that we have. It has gone, the toxic narrative that has gone into the education system. Right? It's like penetrated so deep. Most of our education doesn't reflect the Indianness in it at all, and the young generation which is coming out of it are so disconnected with their roots that they really think that there's nothing up here, and so they need to get a green card or go away. They don't seem to be rooted, connected. It's only after a while when they rediscover, having gone abroad, having seen or heard people, they're coming back and doing something. There seems to be fundamentally something wrong with our education system and curriculum. Maybe you would want to say something about it.
Yeah, well, I agree. But of course, if you have the levers in your own hands to change the education system, then that's up to you. Then you can handle that problem. Then you can address that problem. But as long as your own educational system is in the hands of your enemies, there's nothing you can do. So you'll come a big step closer to control over your education system if you change this Article 30 of the Constitution, or if you get it authoritatively reinterpreted. At least if you abolish the existing inequality. And so all talk about, changing the textbooks and so on, under the present laws, that is just, kurieren am symptoom, as they say. You see, trying to cure the symptoms, but not taking away the causes. You see, the very anti-Hindu contents of the education system are a consequence of the education system being in the hands of your enemies. So again, the straight way to clear this is to change the interpretation of this article or this article itself if necessary. But so if you achieve constitutional equality, you can handle those problems. Whereas today, you can try to change things, but with a hand tied on your back. So I'm all for this change. But again, you see, this is certainly not something that should be done instead of changing the constitution. No, the best way to do it is precisely by changing the constitution. Otherwise, of course, I am all in favor of doing what you can to change the education or to supply, you see, other channels of education so that at least you can bring the contents of Hindu Dharma to the next generation. I'm all for that. And there are numerous Hindus. You need a few people to approach the Supreme Court, or you need a few hundred parliamentarians to change the constitution. But apart from those, there are numerous other Hindus that can also do these jobs. And in fact, to quite an extent, through Ekal Vidyalaya and other networks, this work is being done. But so instead of doing these things piecemeal, amateurish, on the side, the better way is to just, if you take the high road, take the main road, and change the constitution.
Another important issue for us is matter of temple management. See, our temples were actually the ecosystem in a village or in a town. As you know, temples had culture, education, social cohesion, and community kind of center. Once British started taking over the temples, their revenues were chopped off, their lands were leased out to people who were not responsible to give anything back, and the caste system was driven down very hard. So the entire temple system collapsed. Even now, temples are largely in the government control, or at least in the south. In the north, they're completely mismanaged, as you know, be it Kashi Vishwanath or any temple. That is an area which is crying to be rectified, and kind of some changes are needed there. While we do something on Article 30, don't you think this is also a matter of urgency that we kind of look for a solution? The argument against that has always been, who do we give it back to? We do not know which Hindu group to give, X or Y or Z. If I give to X, Y will question or Z will question. So we have a problem. So we are unable to give it, so we are holding it. This is an argument that we repeatedly hear from the government. Yes. So how do you view this temple management or temple mismanagement, and what do you think should happen, and what's the urgency in it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, again, it's a matter of equality, because what you desire for temples is already there in the case of churches and mosques. So again, what you need is equality, and all the necessary rights and powers that you want will automatically be given to you, because they are already given to Christians and Muslims. So that's the principle, but I know that here it's a very complex problem. It's very different in every state, in every case, in fact. Like there are temples that are legacies of some particular community, or someone who wanted that temple for his community, not for everyone else. There are temples that have a heritage of these princely states, and so on and so on. There are very many different cases, and so to some extent, you see, the solution will have to be specific to each case separately. But at any rate, this political principle of no government interference, that should be accepted. And in fact, even before changing the law, there's nothing that should keep the present BJP government from accepting that principle. And they could give the good example by not nationalizing temples in Rajasthan, in Uttarakhand, and other places. They could stop that, because they too, like Congress before them, have been nationalizing temples. And so they should give these back to private society. Now, with private society, I accept that there is a bit of a problem. Whom do you give the temples to? So there, some kind of board will have to be formed that manages the temple, that has open book accounts, that is totally transparent fiscally, just like commercial companies are. So you see, these systems are already in place. You don't have to invent them. You just have to adapt them to the specifics of the temple business. So, so this can be done. I mean, you can make sure that the corruption that is always invoked to justify nationalizations, that is remedied without nationalization. So that can be done. You see, the technical details I leave to lawyers, to bookkeepers, and so on. But the general principle is fairly obvious. You see, civil society is quite capable of handling this challenge of managing temples, and so the state should facilitate that this happens.
Okay. I think now we'll open it up for question answer session.
Yes.
Yeah, Dheeraj, you can enable the chat, please. And then we will take questions. I think Mr. Kamal from UK, he wanted to ask a question. I'll unmute him. He can ask a question. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity. My question is very simply, why not call Muslims in India the second largest majority rather than calling them minority? We all know India has got second largest Muslim population in the whole world. If we put that label to them rather than calling them minority, I think the points you have raised so elucidately will be clarified once for all. And that will bring the justice which Hindus rightfully deserve. What do you think about this, sir?
Well, you see, in discourse, you can say anything you want, and so therefore you can redefine the Muslim community as a second majority if that's what you want. But in legal terms, the terms majority and minority should simply be abolished. They have no place in a secular state. Just as a matter of description, without legal consequences, but as a matter of description, you can indeed question whether the Muslims are a minority.
Exactly.
They are less than 50% of India's population, but they are a very large department of a very powerful and very rich multinational, namely the Ummah, the Islamic community. So to call them a poor, hapless minority is quite misplaced. You see, they are the arm in India, they are the Indian arm of a very large world power, a superpower. Same thing with Christianity. You see, they have centers of finance, centers of strategy outside India with which they are connected. So it's not like they are at the mercy of the Hindus. No, you see, they are the arm of a world power. And so in that sense, also the term minority is misplaced.
Mm-hmm.
It gives a very wrong impression.
Exactly.
If minorities were suffering and needed compensation and so on, what about the Parsis? They are a real minority. Whereas you see Muslims, Christians, I mean, it's so funny also because of their history to make them get compensated through privileges. That's such nonsense. There you should simply have equality.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think even in the definition of minorities is again further defined by each individual state separately. So what happens is, for instance, in Telangana or Andhra Pradesh, a Tamilian becomes a minority. So the minority institutions of Tamilians, just because I have a couple of people on my board, I get the privileges of a minority community. So this has become a big joke actually. I start a completely purely Hindu organization owned by people close to RSS, but the name is some Stanley or Francis or something like that. I'll have one Christian in my board, and then it becomes a minority institution.
Yes, I mean that's something that you can blame Hindus for, that they haven't been creative enough with whatever loopholes the present constitution allowed them. Yeah. Like you could say, for example, linguistically, in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, or the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, Dogri speakers were a minority. So you don't define them religiously, but you really are talking about the Jammu Hindus who speak Dogri. So, on that basis, you could claim minority rights. And similar in many states, the remnants of Gujarat in the business community in Tamil Nadu and so on. There are very many situations like that where you could claim minority rights and somehow nobody has thought of it.
Yeah.
But again, you see, that's fine. You know, if you're really oppressed and under the radar and so on, you may try such loopholes. But I think it's for a majority that moreover is politically in power now,
Yeah.
it's a bit demeaning to try those loopholes. Right
Yeah.
now you can simply get rid of the problem.
Mm.